I still remember the exact moment my son looked at me across the Labor Day barbecue table and said something that made the entire afternoon feel colder than the Chicago wind in January. "Mom, from now on, if you want to visit the kids, we're going to have to charge you $75. At first, I thought he was joking. Daniel had always been the kind of man who tried to soften awkward moments with humor, even when he was a teenager. But there was no smile on his face that afternoon. And the way my daughter-in-law Ashley folded her arms and watched me told me this wasn't a joke at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how that day began, because if you had asked me that morning what I expected from Labor Day, I would have told you something simple. Family. Just family. I woke up early that Monday, just after 6 in the morning, the way people my age tend to do even when there's no alarm clock waiting. My house in Naperville was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after you've lived alone long enough to recognize every creak in the walls. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and looked out at the early September sunlight touching the tops of the maple trees in my yard. Labor Day had always meant one thing in our family, Daniel's barbecue. Ever since he bought his house out in the suburbs, he insisted on hosting the end-of-summer cookout. Burgers, corn on the cob, kids running around the backyard with juice boxes and sticky fingers. It had become a tradition. And traditions matter when you're 67 and most of the people who once filled your holidays are gone. I spent the morning preparing the same dessert I'd brought every year since Daniel was a boy, apple pie from scratch. Not the kind you buy frozen at the grocery store, but the real kind with peeled apples, cinnamon, and a crust you roll out yourself on the kitchen counter. It took me nearly an hour, but I didn't mind. I was thinking about my grandchildren the entire time. Emma had just turned 8, and little Tyler was 5. They loved Grandma's pie. Or at least they used to. By 9 o'clock, the pie was cooling on the rack. And I was packing the car. The drive to Daniel's house took about an hour and 40 minutes depending on traffic, so I made sure to leave before 10. I also had a small bag of gifts in the passenger seat beside me, nothing extravagant, just a puzzle for Emma and a little dinosaur toy Tyler had mentioned the last time I spoke with him on the phone. As I pulled onto the highway, I remember feeling grateful. Not everyone my age still had family close enough to visit on holidays. My church friend Linda used to tell me she hadn't seen her grandson in 3 years because her daughter moved to Oregon. Compared to that, an hour and 40 minutes on Interstate 88 felt like nothing. The late summer air was warm, about 75 degrees, and the sky was perfectly clear. It should have been a beautiful day. And in a way, it was. At least until I pulled into Daniel's driveway and noticed something that made my stomach tighten just a little. The house looked the same as always, the beige siding, the basketball hoop over the garage, the small American flag Ashley liked to hang by the front porch. But when I stepped out of the car, I realized the yard was quieter than usual. No kids laughing. No music from the speakers Daniel normally set up for the barbecue. Just the faint sound of voices drifting from inside the house. I picked up the pie, grabbed the bag of gifts, and walked up the front steps, telling myself not to overthink things. Maybe everyone was inside because it was still early. Maybe the party hadn't really started yet. I rang the doorbell, waited a moment, and finally the door opened. Ashley stood there, looking at me with that polite smile she always wore, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh," she said after a second, glancing down at the pie in my hands. "Margaret, you made it." And I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the day quietly began to change. I stepped inside Daniel's house holding the apple pie carefully with both hands, still warm through the glass dish, and for a moment I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the strange feeling outside. Ashley stepped aside to let me in, but something about the way she did it felt distant, almost formal, like I was a neighbor dropping off a package instead of Daniel's mother. The living room smelled like grilled burgers and charcoal drifting in from the backyard, but the atmosphere was not the lively chaos I remembered from past Labor Day parties. The television was on quietly in the corner showing a baseball game, and a few folding chairs had been arranged near the kitchen island. Daniel stood near the sink with a drink in his hand, talking to his brother Mark. When he noticed me, he paused for just a second before forcing a quick smile. "Hey Mom," he said, walking over and giving me a quick one-armed hug. It was the kind of hug people give when they are distracted. I set the pie down on the counter and looked around. "Where are Emma and Tyler?" I asked. Usually the kids were the first ones to greet me, running toward the door the moment they heard my voice. Daniel glanced toward the hallway. "They are upstairs finishing a movie," he said. "Ashley wanted them to stay inside until the food is ready." Ashley was already opening a cabinet and pulling out plates, moving around the kitchen like she had a long list of things to finish. She barely looked at me again. I tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling and told myself that maybe they were simply busy preparing for the party. After all, hosting people could be stressful. Still, something felt different. In previous years, Ashley had always greeted me with at least a little enthusiasm, asking about my drive or complimenting the dessert I brought. Today she simply nodded toward the pie and said, "You can put that over there." I stood by the counter for a moment, unsure where exactly there was supposed to be, before sliding the dish next to a tray of hamburger buns. Mark walked over and gave me a proper hug. "Good to see you, Margaret," he said warmly. His voice sounded relieved, almost like he was glad another adult had arrived. "Drive was not too bad today," I answered, trying to keep the conversation light. From the back door I could hear a couple of Daniel's neighbors laughing outside near the grill, but the kitchen itself felt oddly tense. Ashley finally wiped her hands on a paper towel and turned toward Daniel. "Are we ready to talk about it?" she asked quietly. The way she said it made my ears perk up. "Talk about what?" Daniel shifted his weight and looked toward me for a moment, then toward Mark, and then back toward Ashley. It was the kind of silent conversation couples have when they think everyone else will not notice. But at 67 years old, you learn how to read those small signals. "Maybe we should wait until everyone sits down," Daniel said under his breath. Ashley did not look pleased with that answer, but she nodded and went back to arranging condiments on the counter. I tried to ignore the strange exchange, yet the uneasiness in my chest grew stronger with every passing minute. Eventually Daniel clapped his hands once and announced that the burgers were ready and everyone should gather around the patio table outside. The backyard looked beautiful in the late afternoon sunlight, with lawn chairs set up around the deck and the smell of grilled corn filling the warm air. For a moment I thought maybe I had been worrying for nothing. Maybe the day would still turn out the way Labor Day always had for our family. We all took our seats around the big wooden table Daniel had built 2 summers earlier. Plates were passed around, drinks were poured, and small talk floated through the air about work schedules, school starting again, and the unusually warm weather for early September. I had just taken my first bite of burger when Daniel suddenly cleared his throat and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. The casual conversation slowly faded as everyone turned to look at him. I noticed Ashley watching me carefully from the seat beside him, her expression calm but alert, like someone waiting for a reaction. Daniel took a breath and said, "Mom, there is something new we wanted to talk to you about today." And the way he said those words made the entire table fall completely silent. For a moment nobody spoke after Daniel said those words. The clinking of forks against plates stopped, and even the laughter from the neighbors on the other side of the fence seemed to fade into the background. I set my burger down slowly and looked at my son, trying to understand why his voice sounded so formal. "What is it, Daniel?" I asked gently. I expected him to mention something ordinary, maybe a school schedule for the kids or a change to Thanksgiving plans later in the year. Instead he glanced at Ashley again, and she gave him a small nod like someone encouraging a speech that had already been rehearsed. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "Mom, Ashley and I have been talking about the way visits work around here," he began. The phrase made my stomach tighten slightly, but I still did not understand where he was going. "What do you mean?" I asked. Ashley leaned forward a little and rested her elbows near her plate. Her voice was calm and polite, the kind of tone people use when they believe they are being completely reasonable. "We have just been trying to organize things better," she said. "You know, with the kids getting older and our schedules becoming more structured." I nodded slowly even though the explanation felt strangely vague. Emma and Tyler were still young children. Their schedules usually involved school, soccer practice, and cartoons on Saturday mornings. There was nothing particularly complicated about it. Mark shifted in his chair beside me and looked down at his drink, clearly sensing the tension that was beginning to settle over the table. Daniel cleared his throat again and continued speaking. "The thing is, Mom, we have noticed that when people visit the house a lot it can become disruptive for the kids' routines." The word disruptive hung in the air longer than it should have. I blinked in confusion. I visited maybe twice a month, sometimes less during the winter. I always called ahead, always brought food, and most of the time I ended up helping clean the kitchen before I left. "I never want to cause problems," I said quietly. "You know that." Daniel nodded quickly as if he had expected that answer. "We know, Mom. That is not what this is about." Ashley reached into a folder that had been sitting on the chair beside her and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The motion was so deliberate that it made my heart begin to beat a little faster. She placed the paper on the table between us and smoothed it flat with her hand. I looked down at it but could not immediately make sense of what I was seeing. It looked almost like a printed list, with neat bullet points and a number written near the bottom. Ashley tapped the paper lightly. "We decided it would be fair to create a small family contribution for regular visits," she explained. "It helps cover groceries, utilities, and the extra things that come with hosting." For a second I honestly believed I had misunderstood the sentence. I looked from the paper to Daniel, waiting for him to laugh and explain that this was some strange misunderstanding. But he simply nodded again, his eyes fixed somewhere near the center of the table. Ashley pointed to the number printed on the page. $75 per visit, she said calmly. "That way everything stays balanced and predictable." The words did not register right away. My mind repeated them slowly, almost like an echo inside my head. $75 per visit. I stared at my son, searching his face for some hint that this was still a joke that had gone too far. But Daniel finally looked up at me and said the sentence that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Mom, if you want to come by and spend time with the kids more often, we just think it is fair to ask for $75 when you visit. I could feel every pair of eyes around the table slowly shifting toward me, waiting to see how I would react. For a few seconds I did not say anything at all because my mind was still trying to understand what my son had just said. $75 to visit my own grandchildren. The number itself was not the part that hurt. I could afford $75 without any difficulty. The part that hurt was the idea behind it. I looked down at the sheet of paper Ashley had placed on the table and noticed the neat little bullet points she had printed out as if this were some kind of official policy. Under the heading Family Visit Contribution there were 3 short lines explaining that regular visits required a $75 payment to help cover household expenses and maintain structure for the children. The words were polite and carefully chosen, but the message behind them felt cold. I slowly lifted my eyes back toward Daniel. You are asking me to pay $75 to see Emma and Tyler? I asked quietly. My voice sounded calmer than I felt inside. Daniel shifted in his chair and rubbed his hands together like someone trying to prepare for an uncomfortable conversation. It is not exactly like that, Mom, he said. It is more like helping out when you visit. Ashley nodded quickly beside him. We just think it keeps things fair, she added. When people come over frequently it increases food costs, utilities, and the general wear on the house. I blinked at her words, wondering if I had stepped into some strange alternate version of my own family. For a moment I considered laughing just to break the tension, but no one else at the table looked amused. Mark cleared his throat softly but did not say anything. I could tell he felt awkward sitting there between us. The neighbors at the far end of the patio had gone quiet too, pretending to focus on their plates while clearly listening to every word. I took a slow breath and tried to keep my voice steady. Daniel, I said, I come here maybe twice a month. Sometimes less. I usually bring food when I visit. I help with dishes. I even watched the kids for a whole week last winter when Ashley had that work trip. Daniel looked down at the table again. We know you have helped before, he said, his tone careful and measured. This is not about the past. We are just trying to set boundaries moving forward. Boundaries. That word seemed to echo inside my head. I had heard younger people use it often in recent years, usually when they wanted to explain why they were creating distance from someone. But hearing my own son use it while talking to me felt strangely unreal. Ashley folded her hands neatly in front of her and spoke again, her voice still calm. We want the kids to grow up understanding that time and resources have value, she explained. This is just one way of teaching that. I stared at her for a moment, trying to decide whether she truly believed what she was saying or if this had always been the plan she had quietly built over time. Daniel finally looked up again and met my eyes. It is not a big deal, Mom, he said. It is just $75. Something about the way he said those words made the silence around the table feel even heavier. Because in that moment I realized the truth was not about money at all. The $75 was just a symbol. A price tag placed on something that should have never had one. I sat there holding my glass of iced tea, listening to the soft buzz of late summer insects in the yard, and I began to understand that this conversation was only the beginning of something much bigger than a Labor Day barbecue. I did not reach for my wallet. I did not raise my voice either. Instead I sat there quietly for a few seconds, listening to the soft creak of the patio chairs and the faint sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. It was strange how ordinary the neighborhood sounded while my own family had just placed a price on my presence. I looked around the table slowly. Mark was staring down at his plate, pushing a piece of corn around with his fork as if he wished he could disappear. One of Daniel's neighbors coughed lightly and reached for his drink, clearly uncomfortable but unsure whether he should say anything. Ashley, however, looked completely composed. She folded the paper neatly and slid it back toward herself as though the conversation had already been settled. Daniel watched me carefully, perhaps expecting anger or tears or some kind of dramatic reaction. But the truth is that when you reach my age, you learn that silence can sometimes say far more than shouting ever could. I picked up my glass of iced tea and took a slow sip before speaking again. "So let me make sure I understand this," I said calmly. "If I want to come visit my grandchildren, you expect me to pay $75 each time I walk through that door." Daniel shifted in his seat again. "It is not meant to sound harsh like that, Mom," he said. "It is just a contribution." Ashley added quickly, "We think it helps create balance. We have to think about what is best for our household." I nodded slowly, even though the explanation still sounded like something from a business meeting rather than a family conversation. The late afternoon sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the backyard. Emma and Tyler had finally wandered outside and were sitting on the grass with a small box of sidewalk chalk, drawing colorful shapes on the concrete near the patio. They looked completely unaware of the conversation happening a few feet away. Watching them laugh together made my chest tighten in a way that was difficult to describe. Because those two children were the only reason I had driven nearly 2 hours that morning. I turned my attention back to Daniel. "You remember when you were 23 and you wanted to buy your first car?" I asked quietly. He blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting the conversation to shift in that direction. "Yes," he said slowly. "Of course I remember." I nodded. "You did not have enough saved at the time. So I wrote you a check for $5,000 to help with the down payment." Daniel looked uncomfortable but did not interrupt. I continued speaking in the same calm tone. "And a few years later when you and Ashley wanted to buy this house, the bank required a larger deposit than you expected. I helped with that too." Ashley's lips pressed together slightly, but she remained silent. "Then there was the winter Emma was born," I added. "Ashley had to return to work earlier than planned, so I stayed here for an entire week to help with the baby. I cooked meals, cleaned the kitchen, and took care of Emma so you both could sleep." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, we appreciate everything you have done," he said. "This is not about that." I studied his face carefully, trying to understand how the boy I had raised had become the man sitting across from me now. The same man who believed it was reasonable to charge his mother $75 for the chance to spend time with her grandchildren. Finally I placed my hands gently on the table and gave a small nod. "I see," I said softly. And in that moment, while everyone around the table waited to hear what I would say next, I began to realize something important. The $75 was not really a fee for visiting. It was a message. A quiet way of telling me that my place in this family had changed. For a little while after that, nobody at the table seemed to know what to say. The conversation that had once been filled with casual holiday chatter now felt stiff and uncomfortable, like everyone was waiting for someone else to fix what had just happened. Emma and Tyler were still laughing softly near the patio, completely absorbed in drawing pictures on the concrete with their chalk. I watched them for a moment, noticing the bright blue circle Emma was carefully outlining while Tyler tried to turn a green scribble into what he insisted was a dinosaur. The sight of them should have made me smile the way it usually did, but that afternoon something inside my chest felt heavier than usual. Daniel shifted his chair and cleared his throat again as if he wanted to move the conversation forward. "Mom, we did not mean for this to turn into something uncomfortable," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "We just thought it would be easier if everything was clear from the beginning." Ashley nodded beside him and added in the same calm voice she had been using all afternoon, "It is really about keeping things organized and fair for everyone involved." I gave a small nod even though the explanation still sounded strange to me. Organized and fair were words people used when dividing office expenses or planning a business meeting, not when talking about a grandmother visiting her grandchildren. I folded my hands loosely in my lap and looked at Daniel again. For a moment I almost spoke about the many Labor Day afternoons we had shared when he was a child, when his father would grill burgers in the backyard while Daniel and his cousins chased each other through the grass. But I stopped myself. Those memories belonged to another time, and the man sitting across from me now seemed to be thinking about something very different. Instead I asked a quieter question. "So this rule applies every time I visit?" Daniel nodded. "That is the idea," he said. "It just keeps everything consistent." Ashley leaned slightly forward again and added, "We think it will help avoid misunderstandings later." I noticed the way she used the word "we" each time she spoke, like a carefully repeated phrase meant to reinforce that the decision had already been made together. The paper she had shown earlier was now folded neatly beside her plate, but the message it carried was still hanging in the air between us. I looked down at the table for a moment and noticed that my burger had grown cold. The corn on my plate was untouched. Around us the warm September breeze moved gently through the trees, and somewhere down the block a dog barked twice before falling silent again. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon people usually associate with family gatherings, yet the atmosphere at our table felt anything but peaceful. Mark finally shifted in his chair and spoke quietly. "Maybe we should just enjoy the rest of the day," he suggested, clearly trying to change the subject. Daniel nodded quickly. "Yes, that sounds good," he said. But even as the conversation drifted back toward safer topics like school schedules and the start of football season, I could still feel the weight of what had just been said. Because the truth was becoming clearer with every passing minute. The $75 was not really about groceries or electricity or household organization. It was something else entirely. A way of placing distance where there had once been warmth. A way of turning family time into something measured and controlled. I sat quietly and listened to the others talk, occasionally nodding when someone asked a polite question about my drive or the weather. But deep inside my thoughts had already moved somewhere else. Because while Daniel and Ashley believed they had just introduced a simple rule for future visits, I had begun to notice something they had clearly forgotten. And that realization was slowly changing the way I looked at everything happening around that Labor Day table. The rest of the afternoon moved slowly after that conversation, like a gathering that had lost its natural rhythm. People continued eating, plates were passed around, and someone eventually turned the music on near the back door, but the easy laughter that usually filled Daniel's Labor Day barbecue never quite returned. I stayed at the table for a while, listening politely as Mark told a story about a project at work and one of the neighbors talked about the upcoming football season. Every now and then someone glanced in my direction as if checking whether I was upset, but I kept my expression calm. After all, raising a child teaches you a certain kind of patience. You learn how to sit quietly through tantrums and wait for emotions to settle before you respond. Eventually I stood up from the table and walked toward the grass where Emma and Tyler were still playing with their chalk. Emma looked up the moment she saw me and smiled brightly. "Grandma Margaret, look," she said, pointing at the drawing she had made. It was a big blue circle with smaller yellow stars around it. "It is the moon and the night sky," she explained proudly. I knelt down beside her and admired the picture the way grandmothers are supposed to. Tyler showed me his dinosaur drawing next, which looked more like a green cloud with legs, but I nodded and told him it was the fiercest dinosaur I had seen all day. Spending those few minutes with them helped steady my thoughts. Children have a way of reminding you what really matters, even when adults around them are making complicated decisions. After a little while Emma asked if I would push her on the swing that hung from the large oak tree at the edge of the yard. I walked over with her and gave the swing a gentle push while Tyler ran circles through the grass pretending to chase invisible creatures. The late afternoon sun was beginning to soften into that golden color that appears just before evening. It should have been a peaceful moment, and in many ways it was. Yet even while I watched the children laugh, my mind kept returning to something Daniel and Ashley had clearly forgotten. When Daniel and Ashley first bought this house 5 years earlier, they had been nervous about the mortgage approval. Housing prices had risen quickly in that part of the Chicago suburbs, and the bank wanted proof that they had enough financial stability to manage the payments. At the time Daniel had called me late one evening sounding anxious and uncertain. He explained that they were just a little short on the required deposit and asked if I could help bridge the gap until they received a bonus from work. I remembered that conversation very clearly because I had spent nearly 30 years saving carefully after my husband passed away. I had always believed those savings were meant to help my family if they truly needed it. So I transferred the money without hesitation. It was a quiet decision that never felt like a burden because helping your child build a home is something most parents would gladly do. But standing there in the backyard that afternoon, watching Emma swing higher and higher while the sunlight moved slowly across the grass, I realized something Daniel and Ashley seemed to have forgotten over time. The help I had given them all those years ago had not simply disappeared once the house keys were handed over. There was still one small detail connected to that loan, one document filed carefully with the bank during the closing process. And the more I thought about that forgotten detail, the more I began to understand that Labor Day might not end the way Daniel and Ashley expected. As the afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the Labor Day barbecue began to wind down the way gatherings usually do. Paper plates were stacked near the kitchen sink, half-empty cups sat on the patio table, and the music playing softly near the back door had shifted from lively songs to something quieter. The neighbors who had come by earlier started saying their goodbyes, thanking Daniel for the food and promising to see everyone again before the weather turned cold. I helped Emma rinse the chalk dust off her hands with the garden hose, and Tyler proudly carried the empty lemonade pitcher back inside as if he had been given an important job. From the outside everything probably looked like a normal family gathering reaching its natural end. But inside my mind the events of the afternoon were still turning slowly, like pieces of a puzzle that had suddenly begun to fit together in a different way. After the children went inside to wash up, I walked back toward the patio where Daniel was gathering plates from the table. For a moment I simply watched him. The sunlight had grown softer now, casting long shadows across the yard, and the air carried that early hint of autumn that arrives in Illinois every September. Daniel looked tired, but not upset. In fact, he seemed relieved that the uncomfortable conversation from earlier had faded into the background. Ashley stepped outside a moment later carrying a stack of napkins. She glanced at me briefly and then turned to Daniel. "I think everything went pretty smoothly," she said quietly, as if she believed the day had unfolded exactly as planned. Daniel nodded and began wiping down the table with a damp cloth. "Yes," he said. "It is good we talked about the new arrangement." I stood there for another moment before speaking. "Daniel," I said calmly. He looked up immediately. "Yes, Mom?" I folded my hands together loosely, the same way I had earlier at the table. "I want you to know something," I said. "I am not upset about the $75. That statement clearly surprised him. Ashley looked at me again, this time with a small crease forming between her eyebrows. Daniel leaned against the table. "You are not?" he asked carefully. I shook my head slowly. "Money itself is not the issue," I replied. "What matters is understanding how things work from now on." For a brief moment none of us spoke. A gentle breeze moved through the oak tree near the swing, and somewhere in the distance a car door slammed as another neighbor left the block. Daniel seemed to relax slightly, perhaps believing the situation had been resolved more easily than he expected. "I am glad you understand," he said. "We just want everything to stay simple and fair." I nodded again, though the word fair still sounded unusual in this context. "Yes," I said quietly. "Fairness is important." Then I paused, letting the moment settle before continuing. "And fairness also means remembering how this house came to be." Daniel's expression shifted slightly as if he had not expected that direction. Ashley crossed her arms gently but said nothing. I met Daniel's eyes and spoke in the same calm tone I had used all afternoon. "When you and Ashley bought this house 5 years ago, the bank required additional funds for the closing process. You remember that?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "You helped us with that?" I gave a small smile, not angry, not bitter, just thoughtful. "Yes," I said. "And during that process there was one small document the bank insisted on adding to the paperwork." Daniel's face grew more serious as he tried to recall the details of that time. Ashley glanced between us, clearly unsure where the conversation was leading. The evening light continued to fade across the backyard while the children's voices drifted softly through the open kitchen window. And in that quiet moment I realized something important. Daniel and Ashley believed that Labor Day had been the day they introduced their new rules. But for me, it had quietly become the day I remembered a detail they had completely forgotten. Daniel stared at me for a few seconds after. I mentioned the document, the way people do when they know they should remember something but cannot quite place it. Ashley shifted her weight slightly beside him, her arms still folded, her expression cautious now instead of confident. The warm evening light continued fading across the backyard, and the air had begun to cool just enough to remind everyone that summer was coming to an end. Inside the house I could hear Emma and Tyler laughing at something on television, their voices drifting through the open kitchen window like a reminder of why any of this mattered in the first place. Daniel finally spoke. "What document are you talking about?" he asked slowly. I noticed that his voice had lost some of the easy confidence it carried earlier in the afternoon. I rested one hand lightly on the back of the patio chair beside me and answered in the same calm tone I had used all day. "When the bank approved your mortgage, they needed to know exactly where the additional funds for the closing costs came from," I explained. "That is standard procedure for a loan that size." Daniel nodded slightly as if the memory was beginning to return. Ashley looked between us again, her brows drawing together. I continued speaking quietly, not accusing anyone, simply explaining the facts the way they had happened. Because the money came from my savings, the bank required a document stating that it was not an anonymous transfer. They wanted clear confirmation about the source. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck again, a habit he had carried since he was a teenager whenever something made him uneasy. "Yes, I remember the paperwork," he said. "There were a lot of forms that day." I gave a small nod. "There were," I agreed. "And one of those forms recorded that the assistance I provided was structured as a family support loan connected to the property." Ashley lowered her arms slowly. The confidence she had shown earlier that afternoon was gone now, replaced by a careful silence. Daniel blinked. "Alone?" he repeated. I met his eyes steadily. "Yes," I said. "A small one compared to the value of the house, but still recorded with the bank so everything remained transparent during the mortgage approval." For a few seconds neither of them said anything. The quiet stretched across the patio while the evening breeze rustled gently through the leaves of the oak tree near the swing. Finally Daniel spoke again, this time more cautiously. "Mom, we thought that was just part of the paperwork the bank needed at the time," he said. "You never mentioned it again." I gave a thoughtful smile, the kind that comes from many years of experience rather than anger. "Because I never needed to," I replied softly. "Helping you start your home was important to me, and I trusted that our family understood what that meant." Ashley shifted slightly beside him, her voice lower when she finally spoke. "What exactly does that document say?" she asked. I looked toward the house for a moment where the kitchen lights had just been switched on, casting a warm glow through the window behind the children. Then I turned back to Daniel and Ashley. "It says that if the property is ever refinanced, transferred, or financially restructured, the original support contribution must be acknowledged and settled as part of the process," I explained calmly. Daniel's expression changed again, not angry, but thoughtful in a way that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the larger picture. For a long moment no one spoke. The Labor Day barbecue had started that afternoon with burgers, music, and what everyone assumed would be another simple family tradition. But standing there on the quiet patio as the last light of the day faded across the yard, it became clear that the conversation about $75 had uncovered something far more important than a fee for visiting. Because sometimes the smallest decisions reveal the deepest truths about how people value the ones who helped them along the way. And as Daniel looked at me that evening, I could see that he was beginning to realize that placing a price on family had consequences he had never considered before.